On April 19, 2022, GE Healthcare's Pharmaceutical Diagnostics Division reported that their OmniPac production facility in Shanghai was unexpectedly shut down. It was because of COVID. Earlier that month, the Shanghai government locked down the megacity's 26 million residents in a peculiar effort to restrain rising cases. When the factory started back up again, it was only at about 25% capacity. Supply to the US was cut by 80% and was not expected to normalize over the next 8 weeks or so until June 2022. The lockdown of this single Shanghai factory had massive repercussions for millions of people receiving treatment in the United States and a few other countries. What is this chemical, and why is it so important? In this video, we're going to talk about iodinated contrast and that brief but concerning time in 2022 when we suddenly ran out of it. But first, let me talk about the Asianometry Patreon. Early access members get to see new videos first, as well as selected references for those videos. Early access helps a lot, and I appreciate every pledge. Thanks, and on with the show. In 1895, we discovered X-rays, which offered a tantalizing look into the human body. But doctors then discovered a problem. You can X-ray a person and see their bones, no problem with that. However, the other various parts inside the human body have similar densities to each other. X-rays pass through them all the same, making them effectively invisible. So how can we look at things like veins, arteries, and other such vessels? Thus came the idea of contrast media, X-ray absorbing materials to illuminate the soft bits of human anatomy. The search began almost immediately. In 1896 came the first success. A pair of doctors, Haschek and Lindenthal, injected mercury sulfide and lime into an amputated hand and then exposed it to X-rays for 57 minutes. The first substances used for living patients were heavy metals administered in the form of insoluble salts and oxides. They worked, kind of. Patients tolerated them poorly, which limited their application. In the 1910s, a guy named J. Edward Burns, apt name as we're about to find out, tried a solution of water, sodium citrate, and oh my god, 10% thorium nitrate. Later on in the 1930s, they started using a suspension of thorium dioxide. They called it Thorotrast, and it worked totally great. That is, until it dawned upon us that thorium is radioactive, and that your body accumulated it inside you until it caused tumors, and those tumors quickly became cancers. So yeah, we needed something else. In 1922, Dr. Earl Osborne of the Mayo Clinic was studying how the body processes iodine. This was not for random curiosity. People were getting injected with large amounts of iodine as a treatment for syphilis. Probably want to know where it goes after the injection. Osborne showed that sodium iodide was being picked up by the kidneys and peed out. Leonard Rowntree, the Mayo Clinic's chief of medicine at the time, remembered that sodium iodide was opaque to X-rays. So he theorized that injecting iodine into the body would allow you to see the veins of the urinary tract with X-rays. And lo and behold, that was what happened. The results were published in a landmark 1923 paper. These early iodine-based contrast media were difficult to use. Iodine was less toxic than something like freaking thorium, but because it was not a heavy metal, you had to inject a large amount of it for decent images. As a result, patients also needed general anesthesia to be injected with it. Ideally, it would be nice to find a water-soluble alternative with less toxicity. Moses Zwick invented the first such possible candidate in 1929, uroselectan, a salt with one iodine atom. Urologists injected patients with it to visualize stones and other malformations. Uroselectan and its sibling, diodone, would dominate its market for 20 years. Unfortunately, the credit for Zwick's work erroneously went to another doctor, Professor von Lichtenberg. Zwick needed to wait many years before he got his due. 4 years later, Zwick and his collaborator, Wallingford, introduced a 6-carbon aromatic benzene ring. It had 3 iodine atoms, which made it quite visible to X-rays, but toxicity issues kept it from wide use. But then in the early 1950s, we discovered that adding two other chemicals, side chains, to the benzene ring made it less toxic. And thus, urographin, as it was called, became the contrast media of choice for the next 30 to 40 years. Even so, these contrast solutions were hardly a walk in the park. In the early 1960s, a Swedish radiologist named Torsten Alman had to inject patients with this stuff. It hurt. A lot. And it emotionally disturbed him to see them suffer such pain from these injections. One day, he injected a patient while prepping them for a lingual arteriogram. Such a thing is used for visualizing the arteries in the tongue. The poor patient, who already had tongue cancer, experienced the pain so intense that they could not see clearly. On that fateful day, Alman, who was a clinical radiologist, not a researcher, became obsessed with finding a new, less painful alternative, and he had an idea. He recalls, "I realized that every time I injected contrast media, the patients experienced pain, but not following the physiological sodium chloride, saline, to rinse the catheter. At the same time, I remember that when swimming in the salty water of the west coast of Sweden as a child, my eyes burnt, but did not in the brackish water of the Baltic Sea outside my hometown Ystad. It must be the hypertonicity of the contrast media solutions that caused the pain." When Alman says hypertonicity, he is referring to the fact that the injected contrast medium is highly concentrated in solutes like salts, more concentrated than a cell's cytoplasm. So when you inject someone with a hypertonic solution, you are creating an imbalance in pressures inside and outside the cell. Thusly, the water in the cells suddenly rush out of them to right the balance. In doing so, the cells experience stress or even death, releasing inflammatory chemicals in doing so. So Alman did some self-study in chemistry. He found out that thorotress might have caused cancer, but it didn't hurt at the time of injection. He also found a paper from the 1930s of an experiment by a Japanese researcher that found that injections of isotonic or moderately hypertonic iodinated oils did not cause pain. From there, he came up with 3 ideas for a non-painful contrast medium. The third idea was to create a water-soluble molecule without certain groups of atoms included. Removing these atoms makes the medium significantly less concentrated. The third idea led to what we now call non-ionic iodinated contrast media. For the next 3 years, Alman met with various pharmaceutical companies in Sweden and the United States. None of them were interested in his idea. Finally, in 1968, the head of research at the Norwegian pharmaceutical company Nygaard & Co. recognized the value of developing such a compound and agreed to work with him. In November 1968, they synthesized the first candidate non-ionic contrast medium. Unfortunately, that one was far too toxic for regular use. After a year and about 80 compounds, one emerged out of the pack. Compound 16, as it was called, is a glucose amide of metrozoate. Metrozoate is the iodine-based contrast medium. It is joined to glucose via a class of chemical compounds called an amide. It is today called metrazamide or Amnapac. Amnapac first entered the market in the early 1970s. It is far less painful and less neurotoxic than current alternatives, making it suitable for spine scans. Metrazamide went on to become a huge hit, the first non-painful contrast medium. Even so, there was room for improvement. Metrazamide cost 15 to 20 times more than existing options, so it might not have hurt the body, but it certainly hurt the wallet. It also came as a freeze-dried powder and needed to be dissolved into water before use, which means a lot of shaking. Early radiologists recall with some bitterness all the hours they spent shaking metrazamide bottles during their residencies. So Nygaard started development on a compound to deal with these shortcomings and in 1982 developed the second-generation contrast medium, iohexol. Iohexol is sold in the market as Omnipac. It is isotonic to human plasma, thus reducing pain, and it is so less toxic that salespeople joked that the test mice would burst before getting a toxic dose. In the United States, there are 2 widely used contrast agents, iohexol and iopamidol. Together, the two have 90% US market share, with the former taking about 50% in the United States and 75% in Australia. It is estimated that 2 doses of iohexol or its close counterpart, iodixonol, also marketed by GE Healthcare as Visipac, are injected every second around the world. Iohexol sales and royalties help make Nygaard one of Norway's biggest pharmaceutical companies and Allman a very rich man. Nygaard later merged with Amersham Health and then was acquired by GE Healthcare in 2003 for $9.5 billion. Today, GE still produces the active pharmaceutical ingredients for iohexol in Lindenes, Norway. The iohexol is then sent to GE's Omnipac fill and finish facilities in Shanghai and Cork, Ireland. There, the factories mix and prepare, sterilize, inspect, and package the iohexol. Allman used his money to fund additional contrast studies at the Malmo General Hospital. He passed away in 2016 at the age of 83, a life well lived. Modern healthcare is highly dependent on radiologic imaging for diagnosing and treating people. Imagine doing the wrong treatment because you were not able to properly see what was happening inside. According to Harvard Medical School, never heard of those guys before, over 80 million contrast scans are performed each year in the United States. Back in 1980, that was just 3 million. One study in 2019 found that we do almost 30,000 contrast-enhanced CT scans per 100,000 patients. Outpatient hospitals ran 10,728 of that, and emergency rooms 8,740. Most of which were for abdomen and pelvis scans. Second to that are chest scans. This CAT scan boom makes iodinated contrast drugs some of the most commonly used, with some 120 million doses each year in the United States and another 100 million worldwide. Most hospitals operate on a just-in-time basis, so they were not stockpiling any contrast media. For a long time, that was fine, because the stuff was plentiful. Dr. Gopal Punjabi at Hennepin Healthcare said in a May 2022 interview, "We use it like water. It's there. We use it all the time. Our current supply is about 4 weeks worth. I think in about 2 or 3 weeks, we'll have to start making some hard decisions if we don't locate more contrast." GE has one other factory producing Omnipac over in Ireland, but when the Shanghai 2022 lockdown in Shanghai happened, that Ireland factory was already operating at full capacity. There are 3 other companies making this stuff for the American market: Bayer, Bracco Diagnostics, and Gerbert. Certain American hospitals using these other suppliers, Boston Medical Center for instance, were largely unaffected. However, the competitors cannot scale up in time to make up for GE's shortfall. And interestingly enough, the GE factory shutdown did not affect locations outside of the United States that much, with the exception of Australia. China and Europe apparently had their own roster of domestic suppliers. Hospitals affected by the shortage responded to the sudden and unexpected supply shock in 3 major ways. First, they began limiting the doses of contrast medium used for each scan. Newer CT scanners can handle doses up to 66% smaller at the cost of higher noise. Simpler steps were also taken to cut down on waste. For instance, single-use vials were divided and repackaged into smaller syringes. Second, some hospitals started operating CT scans on an acute risk of life and limb basis. This means that scans were only done for specific emergency situations like severe trauma or hemorrhage. If it was not critical, then the procedure was delayed, or if the doctor can do the diagnosis without the imaging, like if the potential stroke patient is showing obvious signs, then they can skip or postpone the scan. Some sought alternative scanning technologies. For instance, a magnetic resonance imaging, or MRI. You sit inside it for a long time and it goes gonk, gonk, gonk until you lose your mind from claustrophobia. Or a magnetic resonance angiography, or MRA, which works along the same principles. Or an ultrasound. It generates and sends sound waves into the body, which are reflected back to the machine depending on the acoustic characteristics of the flesh. The machine then visualizes that. Or a Doppler ultrasonography, which is a type of scan that uses the Doppler effect to visualize the movement, velocity, and direction of blood in our veins. Or finally, just a plain old CAT scan without contrast media. Third and last resort, you could try using a different contrast medium. What different medium you use depended on the specific scan. You might take barium, orally for abdominal and pelvic CT scans, though this won't work if it might leak out of a perforation in the intestines. Another studied alternative are mediums based on gadolinium. Gadolinium is a rare earth that has been used as a contrast medium for MRIs since 1988. When injected, it is usually flushed out by the kidneys after 2 hours. However, if the patient has chronic kidney disease or any sort of decreased renal function, then the injection puts them at risk of developing nephrogenic systemic fibrosis, a hardening of the skin, tissues under the skin, and skeletal muscle. Therefore, using gadolinium-based contrast mediums for X-rays is considered off-label use by the FDA. It is basically a last resort. Oh, also, it costs about 4 to 5 times more than iodinated contrast mediums, and since it is a rare earth element, it's only available from China. On June 8, 2022, GE Healthcare announced that its Shanghai facility was back at full capacity again. Local COVID restrictions had been eased at that time. By the next month, July 2022, things were largely back to normal. GE has since taken steps to protect against future shocks and to meet future anticipated demand. This includes a $30 million expansion for their Ireland production facility, as well as an $80 million expansion in their active pharmaceutical ingredient facility in Norway. There was no mention of the facility in Shanghai, but I reckon it is also getting an expansion due to the growing contrast medium market in China. The Shanghai iohexol supply chain disruption says many things. First, it reminds us of how important events occurring far away can bring home big feathery chickens to roost. Even when not directly affected, second-order effects and other ripples in the pond can turn into tsunamis that overwhelm us. Second, we should check as to how the American healthcare system came to be so dependent on a just-in-time system for these critical materials. To point, the actual ingredient was still widely available. It was the packaging and finishing step in the chain that was so broken. Why was so much of this critical medium being finished in China during the pandemic? Third, and finally, we should take a second to acknowledge the decades of hard work, personal struggle, and intense chemistry research to have come up with the contrast mediums we have today. This stuff is a little piece of magic of its own. We literally inject ourselves with a heavy X-ray stopping liquid, and it is not only safe, but also not painful. That is pretty awesome. Alright, that's it for tonight. Thanks for watching. Subscribe to the channel, send me an email. I love reading your emails, and I'll see you guys next time.